Hello, and welcome to Warhammer 40k's Grim History from the Beyond. I'm Zeckthar,
And I'm Yuksen.
and we are the chroniclers of all that was, and all that will be in the 31st millennium. We've seen the rise and fall of many empires, and for the next couple of months, we will be discussing the tumultuous history of the world of Armageddon.
That's right, Zeckthar. This week we'll be discussing the frontline soldiers of the Second and Third Wars of Armageddon. The Astra Militarum Steel Legion and Gazgul Ork Boyz. But Zeckthar, before you start in on the history of the Steel Legion, we got a couple of questions from Hermes, and he asked, so the distance between galaxies is vast and full of Tyranids. They get activated by the Pharos device when Gilliman travels back to Earth. Has any species gone to any other galaxy, or is it from another galaxy? For example,
go ahead. Sorry.
First off, they weren't activated by the Pharos device, right?
Well, kind of. I mean, that's the Pharos draws them to the Milky Way system like a beacon. That's the way it's described. So, I mean, if you want to say it like activated their invasion, yes, it did. But if you're saying they were like sitting dormant way out in space, and then all of a sudden this turned them on, no, not like that.
And when we're referring to the Pharos device, we're talking about way back when, like the Horus Heresy period, right?
Correct. With when you talked about Alexis Pollux and I talked about Barabbas, that one.
Yeah. And so as far as we know, the ones that, other than of course us who aren't in the same galaxy,
right?
The ones that have been out in the area of the Tyranids is also the Silent King was out there, and then the Nikesars.
Yes, pancake polar bears.
And for all we know, another possibility is the old ones, since they aren't really described as being from this particular galaxy or having died off or disappearing into another galaxy. They sort of fade off in history.
Yeah, the only thing we really know is after the war in heavens, they disappear. Now, if they were all killed off or they just left, we never been able to figure that out. That's kind of still a mystery. But that does kind of lead into Hermes' second question, which is, why does the method of travel not work between galaxies? Does the webway and the warp extend galaxies, or does its galaxy have its own version of chaos? So one of the reasons why travel doesn't take place between different galaxies is mainly because of the Halo star system, which is on the outskirt of the Milky Way system. And from when we talked about, what's his face? The guy that's like the spitting image of Terran 42's Alexander.
Solar Macarius?
Yes, that guy. Thank you. When he got to the very edge in the Halo star systems, he wanted to keep going further. But one of the problems with that was, quite frankly, trying to warp past that point. They couldn't really do it very well for a couple of reasons. One is because it was almost like it was blanked out. It was like blocked off. And the second reason is because that's as far as the Astronomicon reached.
Right.
So if you picture the Astronomicon like a lighthouse, it's probably the best way to describe it anyway. So you can see everything anyways where the light touches. But if you go past that point, you have no idea what's there. So they just don't go past it. Now, the whole webway thing, I think the whole webway is within the Milky Way system as well. Don't you, Yuksen?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
And who knows, maybe it does expand to other ones. That's how the old ones disappeared. They obviously put locks on those doors so that other people can't follow them. But as far as I know, the webway is still centered within the Milky Way system.
Yeah.
I think that covers it. But you got anything else for Hermes there, Yuksen?
No. Other than the fact that as we don't know much about the galaxy that the Tyranids come from, but there are actually two theories on why they're popping up in this galaxy. One of them is they are coming to consume everything. The other is actually that they are fleeing from something. Right. Either another race or a giant catastrophe.
One is, I mean, they're both troubling in and of themselves, but the one that kind of is a little worrying to me is the fact that they're running from something.
Yeah.
The Tyranids, as mighty as they are running from something. That's a problem.
Yeah. One of the things that popped in my mind when we were going over this the other day was kind of reminded me of the beasts when they first showed up. How all of a sudden all those can't remember what they're called.
I believe it was an insectoid species known as the chromes. Yuksen?
And they wiped them out all out, and they're like, "Yay!" And they didn't realize that. Oh wait, the orcs were coming.
The largest log we've ever seen.
Right.
Well, thank you for the questions, Hermes. Getting back to what we're going to be talking about today, the Steel Legion, along with the Ork Boyz. Now, the regiments of the Austra Militarum vary widely from one world to the next, as we actually discussed a couple months ago. Civilizations, training, and technology levels are widely varied from one culture to another within the Imperium of Man, resulting in some forces being mounted on horseback, carrying spears.
Like the Tones.
Mm-hmm. Next to the elite troops bearing advanced grab chutes deployed from Valkyrie assault carriers.
Like the Legions.
But within these parameters, large formations of mechanized infantry are very uncommon within the formation of the Imperial Guard. The reason for this rarity is that the resources required to equip and maintain vast numbers of armored vehicles are difficult to acquire, even for important personnel such as Imperial commanders and planetary governors. Typically, gathering so many war machines also requires a pact or agreement with the Adeptus Mechanicus, or is the tech priests and engine seers of Mars, who ensure that these vehicles can operate and be repaired should they suffer damage in the heat of battle. The most well-known and renowned of the rare few mechanized infantry regiments in the Imperium are those founded upon the hive world of Armageddon. While some Austra Militarum formations rely upon horses or other such conventional steeds, the Steel Legion of Armageddon ride in a battle on mounted infantry within the hulls of the trusted Chimera armored transports. The high numbers of chimeras amongst the Steel Legion regiments is due to the highly industrialized nature of their homeworld. Armageddon is one of the foremost manufacturing planets for chimeras and produces vast numbers of this vehicle for use across the Imperium of Man. So great is Armageddon's output of chimeras that an extremely high proportion of regiments raised from this world are mechanized infantry. These highly mobile forces are skilled at rapidly redeploying convoys of vehicles to engage the enemy. Often the Steel Legion's vehicles simply overrun the enemy's front lines, allowing their infantry to dismount and sweep the area clear of aggressors. Now, the first recorded action I found of this unit was all the way back in 776.M36. But trouble started and ended rather quickly by the Steel Legion on the agri world of Cassel. It was later known as the Cassel Rebellion, but more commonly known as the 6-Hour Revolution for its short duration. Now, it all started with the planetary governor, Supreme Pontiff Scalen, who was known for possessing eccentric views, but was otherwise regarded as loyal to the Imperium and reliable. However, rumors began to circulate that Scalen believed that his imperial cult was the only true faith of the God Emperor, and the rest of the Imperium should be made to recognize this. When the rumors reached Colonel Kleist of the Armageddon 16th Steel Legion, which was at the time stationed on Cassel following exemplary service in the Lotharn campaign, he petitioned the administratum for permission to investigate the Supreme Pontiff. But before authority could be received, Kleist's hand was forced when Scalen renounced the authority of the High Lords of Terra and called all the Cassellans to join a crusade and bring the way of the Emperor's flesh to the rest of the Emperor's domain. With his regiment already mobilized, Kleist was able to bring the rebellion under control before it could really spread. Less than a solar hour after Scalen's announcement, the 16th Steel Legion's chimeras were rolling out of the regiment's encampment and marched on the planetary capital, Port Cassel. The defenders of Port Cassel were ill-equipped to face an armored assault, and the capital's main gate soon fell to the Loyalists. Kleist split his forces in two columns, with the smaller sent to capture the city's spaceport and communications center, and the larger led by Kleist himself to assault the divine palace of the Supreme Pontiff. The palace was guarded by the majority of Scalen's bodyguard, and his only armored vehicle, an aging Lehman Russ tank. Nevertheless, the 16th Steel Legion quickly overwhelmed the defenders and captured the Pontiff. After less than 6 solar hours, the Cassel Rebellion was over before it could even really fully take shape. But to tell you the truth, brother, the Steel Legion is most well known for the Second and Third Wars of Armageddon, which we will be talking about in the coming weeks. But who are these mobile guard formations facing off against, brother?
Why, Orcs, of course.
I kind of figured. But perhaps you give the people a little bit more than just orcs.
Right. Well, starting with the basics, your average orc warrior is generally identified as a boy. These boys start at around 6'6" or so. Now, I say start at because they have this unusual ability of constantly growing, and the rate of growth increases with the size of the army they are in, because, yeah, it's a method of them fighting each other, and how they fight each other helps them build up, trying to get on top. Orcs are seen by their enemies, which is pretty much everybody else in the universe, as primitive, barbaric, hyper-violent, and crude. But they're the most successful and widespread intelligent species, well, if you could call them really intelligent, in the whole galaxy, outnumbering possibly every other intelligent star-faring species, even humanity, with the very plausible exception of the Tyranids. Orcs are possibly the most warlike aliens in the 41st millennium, and their number is beyond counting. Amid constant seething tides of battle and bloodshed, burgeoning orc stellar empires rise and fall. Mercifully, most are short-lived, soon destroying themselves in a maelstrom of violence and internecine conflict. But should the orcs ever truly unify, they would crush all opposition. The orc way of life is as straightforward and brutal as the orcs themselves. Much like their approach to everything else, orcs do not waste time pondering why they do things or how they might do them better. Instead, they simply act, instinct and ability driving them on in a never-ending cycle of violence and conquest. Orcs have their own distinct culture, the origins of which are lost in the dim and distant past. Though likely a corruption of whatever may have come before, by and large it functions very well. Perhaps this is because the fundamental tenet of their society is a simple one that even the most pea-brained snotling can understand. Might makes right. Orcs instinctively obey those larger than themselves, provided they are a healthy shade of green. Most orcs would rather die than bow to a non-greenskin's will. The rulers of orc society are the most powerful orcs of all, known as war bosses or warlords. These monstrous killing machines can reach up to 10 Terran feet in height, and their sheer muscular bulk makes them wider at the shoulder than a fully armored space marine. Though some war bosses rise to prominence through low cunning, most seize power through the application of brute force. War boss will hold dominion over all he surveys and beat the living daylights out of anyone who says differently. His decisions are enforced by a ruling caste of orcs known as knobs, who are larger, richer, and more aggressive than the normal orcs, and never miss an opportunity to remind them of it. The bulk of an orc horde, which can be hundreds or even thousands strong, is comprised of a great mobs of infantry that call themselves boys. Goth clan mobs, in particular, are famous for their sheer number of boys that they can field at war, often outnumbering their foes several times over. Orcs tend to be lazy and forgetful, and only war and the preparation beforehand really bring out their innate talents. The bigger, meaner orc boys will lord it over the smaller, ganglier ones. Even a subservient orc is of limited use when it comes to practical tasks that do not involve fighting. Most of the day-to-day running of orc society is therefore left to the Gretchen, whose duties include preparing food, taking messages, hauling stuff about, general organization, and just being around the place when an orc wants something to kick. This gives the orcs plenty of time to swagger about, getting into fights and coming up with new ways to kill things. The Gretchen are happy enough in their role. They bear little resentment towards their superiors, for to them, orcs are just a fact of life. Questioning this usually leads to a clip around the ear and not much else. Individual Gretchen can enjoy a relatively comfortable existence by providing valuable services to their orc masters. In fact, the Gretchen have created an entire enterprise culture of their own within the orc-dominated society, and many Gretchen operate their own black market business on the side, selling fungus beer, roasting squigs on sticks, coordinating the bets when a fight breaks out, and then looting the resulting corpses. Orcs see themselves as the toughest race in the galaxy, mightier by far than humans Eldari or Tau. To prove that point, the orcs are more than willing to fight and kill everything that crosses their path. One of the greatest strengths the orcs possess is the simplicity with which they approach their existence. For an orc, the universe is an incredibly straightforward place, free of the angst and worry that plagues most other races. Orcs do not try to influence their own destiny and get frustrated when plans do not work out as they expected. They do not look for something to blame, well, except perhaps the nearest Gretchen or Haid rival tribe, and certainly do not reflect on weaknesses in their own way of doing things. They just try again, a different way, usually because they have forgotten how they did it the last time. Thus, the orcs make remarkable progress by trial and error, without counting the cost. Meanwhile, other intelligent races, steeped in high-flown philosophy, fall into the same traps time and again, doomed to stagnate and decline, unless, of course, they are first conquered by the orcs. So long as the average orc has someone to fight, someone bigger than him to tell him who to kill next, and someone smaller than him to beat up, he will know contentment. Orcs don't tend to go hungry as they can eat virtually anything, even grot snotlings or one another at a pinch. Greenskins have no concept of cannibalism or the moral outrage that accompanies it, as it is only natural that the bigger orcs should live at the cost of those weaker than themselves. With war and killing as their only real motivators, most orcs have little interest in gathering material wealth or luxuries. The one exception to this is a desire to possess ever bigger and louder weapons and vehicles. An orc will go to almost any length to get his hands on a louder shooter or faster war buggy. He will obsess over his acquisition until the exact moment he has it, at which point his eye will stray to something even bigger. Another thing is that the bigger they get, the more intelligent they get. This is why creatures such as Gazgul, who are massive, are actually able to come up with different strategies, whereas your average boy's thoughts are basically follow the big orc and attack.
Speaking of big orcs, you briefly mentioned something that we actually completely forgot to talk about last time we talked about orcs. Knobs. You kind of briefly mentioned them, but you think you could go a little bit more into detail on them? They're actually kind of important. They're like 9-coms, right?
Yes and no.
They're like non-coms all the way up to like the rank under general, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I know that sounds really confusing, but why don't you go ahead and explain how it works?
Well, a knob is larger than an orc boy, obviously, but is also at the same time smaller than an orc war boss. But because they're bigger, they have authority higher than a boy. So basically, they can range though from either they can be in charge of their own knob group, which is weird. They are seen quite often leading the Ork Boyz as the leader of that mob of boys. But they are also the ones that are used as the war boss's assistants and bodyguards, which means they also get the better equipment than the boys. It is also considered that Nob is believed to be an Orcish bastardization of the Imperial Low Gothic word for noble. Now, to rise through the ranks of the orcs requires cunning, brutal cunning, and smashing the heads of any challenger to a Nob's throne. Orc Nobs often come to blows with rival mob leaders and go out of their way to prove their competency to their war boss. Nobs are thus both feared and revered. They can thrive as leaders provided they can survive a few knives in the back and dole out appropriate punishments. They are universally arrogant and headstrong, but through surviving numerous battles with the enemy and their own boys, they are cunning enough to make deals with some enemies. Serving as a crude greenskin ruling class, the Knobs are never above reminding the boys who's in charge by making a few bloody examples. This could involve hacking up some suitably impressive foes or knocking a few fractious boys' blocks off. The Knobs aren't too fussy, just so long as it gets the message across. Sounds simple, right?
Yeah, that's as clear as mud, sir. I hear, yeah, it sounds incredibly simplistic, except for it. Like I said before, like you were saying before, anyways, is that knobs range all the way from non-coms all the way to like lieutenant general. So
Yeah.
they understand what the ranking is and how the ranking, quite frankly, is just their size, right? That's how you can tell which one's a higher up the food chain knob.
Generally,
Okay.
it's a safe assumption. Let's put it that way. It's a safe assumption. But of course, then unfortunately, that's where the simplicity ends because you have the odd boys, which are completely outside of this
Right.
very simple-ish ranking system.
Right. Those are like the Max and the Doctors and the Weird Boys, right?
Yes. But you also have, of course, their different cultures, which is also even more, can be even more confusing. And clans, all of which we discussed when we did our month-long deep dive into orcs. What was it?
Oh, about a year and a half
Year
ago,
and a
maybe?
half?
Yeah. I think it was the one we did right before Ultramarines, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I believe we
Last,
did Ultramarines in November.
yeah, so last October, I want to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, so if anybody wants to hear about that, I will actually set up on our YouTube channel. I'll set up a podcast that has all the orcs in it. But is there anything else that we should cover like today that has to do with orcish cultures? That has to do with, Armageddon?
Well, I should probably go over how a WA starts. Right.
You know what, Yuksen?
Oh, starts, I mean.
That's a pretty good idea. Go ahead.
Okay, so first and foremost, of course, amongst all the orcoid instincts is literally the need for an orc to wage war. It's what they were built for, period. Orcs need war just as a human or Eldari needs food and water, and over the long millennia of their existence, the Greenskins have become very, very good at it. Due to their inherently aggressive nature, orcs constantly fight amongst themselves to prove who is the strongest, sharpening their inborn warrior skills and weeding out the weak. Though this process usually poses little threat to the larger galaxy. However, orc populations can reach a form of critical mass that can unleash a full-scale interstellar migration of greenskins. This violent migration and the planetary assaults that result from it is what Imperial savants refer to as a war, a crusade of pure aggression that crashes through multiple star systems in an absolute orgy of fury and violence. Note, this is different than what WA is concerning orc abilities, and also WA is translated into war in orc language.
Right. It's very much like DACA has multiple different meanings for it.
Well, DACA is either loud or very shooty.
Right. Oh, yeah. So, that's kind of the same concept, right?
Is really war.
Well, it's also the energy that the odd boys use, but yeah.
And what they subconsciously use.
The orcs have made things so simple, they've made them complicated again. But yeah, sorry. Go ahead, man.
Yeah. Whoa! Usually start small, perhaps even as small as a single orc who is visited by the orcoid deities Gork and Mork with dreams of great carnage. He will impart this vision to others of his kind through repeated blows to the head, or if he's of a more intellectual bent, he will build a great orc war machine like a Gargant that is the very image of his savage gods. Rumors of the coming war will spread through the local Orkoid society, and the orcs begin to unite. New war bands join the growing throng with every passing day. The war boss will fight his way to the top of the hierarchy of this growing greenskin horde and earn the status of a warlord, adding the armies of those clans he conquers to his own horde. As news of his new position spreads, the trickle of orc reinforcements will grow into a green flood. Orc mechs will begin to collaborate on more and more outlandish projects, building even larger war machines and weapons for the war. Smoke belching mobile fortresses and titanic war engines are cobbled together out of nothing more than heaps of scrap metal and the always heavy-handed enthusiasm of the greenskins. Another side effect of the growing gestalt psychic energy of a war. With each victory, the new war boss's legend grows, and more followers flock to his blood-soaked banner. As he fights to retain command of his ever-growing horde against a constant stream of challengers, he will subsume the armies of those he conquers into his own tribe. Gorkanoks and Morkanoks appear in growing numbers, their pilots seeking out the war with a feverish intensity. Whole mobs of mech boys raise towering scaffolds, within which stampas and even gargants start to take shape, these mighty effigies igniting some primitive drive within the minds of the orcs who see them, causing the flow of war energy they subconsciously generate to reach fever pitch. At this stage, there is still much rivalry between the various clans and tribes, and each will strive to outdo all the others in terms of sheer destruction that can be wrought by its war machines. Those mechs without the resource to construct stampas and gargants will instead create mobs of clanking killicans and death dreads, or battle wagons from which war bosses can lead their armies to war. Soon the emergent war begins to span worlds instead of just continents. Entire native populations are forced into slavery, merely to manufacture ammunition for the horde's guns. Crude factory ships and war hulks are bashed into shape, the better to transport the orc armies into battle. When the lure of imminent bloodshed can be resisted no more, the deadly fervor washing through the horde overflows. Teeming orc armies mass and swell with the roar like savage oceans, and the skies fill with crude and bulky orc spacefaring vessels. Once these masterworks of destruction take form, even more greenskins are drawn towards the horde by the impending promise of these massive war engines' use and the exciting carnage they will reap. Most of the orc boys of the horde simply relish the chance to get into a really good fight or scrap. But those amongst their numbers who dream of becoming part of a truly awesome vista of destruction often choose the roles of crewmen and gunners on mobile battle fortresses and stampas. The grand musters that precede a full-scale orc invasion are an awe-inspiring sight. As the orcs gather for battle, smoke from thousands of oily engines fill the sky. The ground trembles beneath great wheels, tracks, and the thunderous strides of towering gargants. Armies of greenskins stretch across the horizon, raising their banners high to proclaim their reputations and allegiances, their war cries audible for Terran miles around. Looming Gorkanoks and Morkanots, bizarre artillery pieces and force field generators chug, clink, and buzz amidst the green throng. Armadas of rusty vehicles raise roiling thunderheads of dust into the atmosphere, whilst decajets roar overhead, leaving contrails of filthy smoke. Speed freaks rev their engines, and the boys fire their guns into the air as a carpet of Gretchen spreads out in front of the army. Eventually, the battlefield is barely visible beneath the endless sea of green, each orc warrior certain that the ground will soon be stained red. Here the power of the war is palpable as a way of raw aggression, And the orcs believe Gork and Mork are gazing eagerly down from the warp to see how their warriors will fare. Then, as one with an almighty bellow, the orcs surge forwards, and another world is plunged into unending war. Those greenskins that do not aid in the construction of the war machines seek out like-minded fellows who fight in the manner that most appeal to them. The orcs call these groups cults, of which the vehicle-obsessed cult of speed is the most widespread and well-recognized in the Imperium, though by no means the only cult that exists in orc society. The Storm Boys and Flash Gits also represent cults, while those orcs who are unusually sensitive to the growing pool of gestalt psychic energy surrounding a gathering war may become Weird Boys. Hundreds of other orc war bosses will add their own armies to the cause of a new war as the green skin assault begins to spread across the whole star systems rather than just a single world. Now, the orcs who launch a war generally have little in the way of a coherent combat doctrine, like the other major intelligent species of the galaxy. Their only goal is destruction and mayhem, in as large a quantity as they can muster. The orcs are a plague upon the other civilizations of the universe, a race of genetically engineered bioweapons whose true purpose was lost ages ago, but who still carry on the fight against anyone at any time, for no other reason than their own joy in destruction and slaughter. Well, I think that wraps up the gist of the basics.
Thank you. I mean, I think we got it all. Is there anything that else that we kind of need to talk about with orc culture in particular?
I think one of the groups that was left out when it comes to mentioning them is the, what do they call it, Snagga Boys? The primitive.
Those are the ones from the normally in that one clan, right? The snake bites, or
Yeah,
snake biters.
one of the cults that I think should be mentioned on along with the cult of speed and whatever are the Snagga Boys, which are basically, we're going back to basics. We will use squigs over mechanical. I think they also even have
Squig cavalry.
battle wagons, but they're run by squigs.
Squigs and
actual engines.
Squig hogs, right?
Yeah.
Those are the other ones. I
Yeah.
can't remember. Do they have boars in this one?
No.
Or is it just all squigs?
Everything's squigs.
Ah, right. Well, if you don't mind.
How about you tell us about the grueling training of the Steel Legion?
Sure. Although, quite frankly, anyways, any training that the Astra Militarum does is probably pales in comparison to just everyday life of an orc.
Yeah.
They kind of, yeah. But anyways. Now, on the high world of Armageddon, like most of its ilk, it consists of huge ash wastes choked with toxic pollutants and corrosive chemicals. Some regions of the planet consist of jungles and oceans, but the pervasive effects of the industrial pollution are inescapable outside of the world's great hive cities. Teeming with humanity, Armageddon's hive cities are not simply manufacturing centers. They're also packed with crowded workers and overseers necessary to keep the massive industrial complex running. These conditions give rise to a seemingly endless series of savage gang wars that are up regularly amongst the underclasses on Armageddon. Many recruits into the Steel Legion are taken directly from veterans of these brutal struggles for dominance of the Underhive, as only the fiercest and most implacable gangers manage to survive and even thrive upon the carnage. The gangs of Armageddon are sometimes conscripted in mass into the Steel Legions, and it is said that most
kind of like, orc mentality here. You survive. You will.
Well,
the ones who survive make it.
I kind of understand it, though. I mean, if you've got a huge orc invasion on your planet, it's like, who do you want to just rush into the army as quick as possible? The people that have no idea how to fire a gun, or people who've been doing that for the last, 10, 15 years? I mean, I can kind of see why they do it.
Yeah.
Although, and it does seem that
funny how it's kind of very orky.
Orky. You know, the more that we talked about the orcs last time, anyways, the more we found that the Imperium is actually very similar in some situations to orc culture. But
Yeah.
I do also want to mention here, anyways, that these gangers seem to be a little bit more coherent or cohesive, a little bit more cohesive compared to like other gangers that we have briefly talked about, like the ones from Necromunda or the ones you talked about, the cannibals from what was it, Mordian, where the Iron Guard comes from.
So. Yeah. Mordian.
So this is but anyways, it is said that most of these gangs, by the way, require little to no additional training to be effective soldiers. In fact, some squads that were formerly gangers excel at inventive and cunning small unit tactics on the battlefield. The Steel Legion is sometimes supported by conscripted platoons of Planetary Defense Force troops and rattling sniper teams. The guardsmen of the Steel Legion wear uniforms that include a mustard yellow greatcoat, gas masks to protect themselves from Armageddon's toxic environment, and rounded helmets over black infantry fatigues. The guardsmen of the Steel Legion, in addition to their las guns, make use of grenade launchers and missile launchers as heavy weapons. Their regiments are supported not only by chimeras, but also by Leman Russ executioners. The troopers of the Armageddon Steel Legion are particularly skilled in the arts of deploying mechanized infantry and have a special expertise at battling orcs. In addition, guardsmen from Armageddon make fine assault troops for fighting in urban and hive city environments, as well as heavy industrial zones, chemical sumps, and other such toxic regions. Their equipment and experience with such acrid environments make them invaluable for trudging through all sorts of polluted and otherwise noxious wastelands, from under hives filled with toxic residue of ancient atomic generators to ruin-filled swamps rife with hallucinogenic flora, quicksand, and near-invisible pockets of lethal gas. So toxic are the ash wastes of Armageddon that a trooper breathing its air freely would feel their lungs begin to melt and rot away. It is for this reason the Armageddon Steel Legions are heavily protected against toxic and polluted environments. Possibly the most iconic piece of war gear for the Steel Legion is the rebreather unit carried by every trooper. These units are capable of filtering out the worst effects of any airborne poisons and are the primary reason that many Steel Legion guardsmen have survived doing battle upon the ash wastes. Senior officers have rebreathers that are often shaped into masks similar to that of a greeting skull. The guardsmen of the Steel Legion are not the only things protected from venomous environments within these regiments. Throughout the Steel Legion, all vehicles are fully enclosed and possess airtight seals to ward passengers from the foul and acidic atmosphere encountered by convoys traversing the ash wastes. The Steel Legion takes special care to protect their mighty banners, each one hung with trophies of honor and no small amount of orc kill markers. These banners are coated with highly resistant materials in an attempt to preserve them from the wasteland's acidic decay. Now, before we move on to back to the orcs and what kind of weapons they have, which are kind of insane. You know who these guys remind me a lot of? I bet you could figure it out, actually.
Maybe Krieg?
Well, yes, except for they're not clones. So, I mean...
And they don't use shovels. What's
no,
wrong
they
with
do have
them?
shovels. They do have shovels. I actually looked it up. One of the things that they have with them is an entrenching tool. So they do have the shovel, but they also carry a combat knife. So they've got one up on them Craig boys.
Krieg.
Quite frankly, anyways, I probably would prefer the Steel Legion over the Krieg, but what do you think?
I would probably take, well, it would depend on the situation. Trench warfare, I'd still take the Krieg over Steel Legion.
Okay, but why?
Because the Steel Legion focuses more on mechanized assault in comparison to the trench warfare.
Which is why I actually would prefer the Steel Legion, because you would roll over the trenches. But honestly, I think they both serve their needs, like you said, anyways. It depends on the situation. You know, one favors one thing more than the other. But
yeah,
I personally would probably pick more often than not the Steel Legion because they don't seem nearly as depressed. I mean, the Krieg just is like, I'm not happy unless we're on a suicide mission. And then it's okay, I guess. I mean, that kind of seems to be the reoccurring theme from the Krieg. But I don't know. What do you think?
I think your viewpoint on the Krieg mentality isn't exactly in line with their actual mentality.
Well, it just seems like they seem to like when you were talking about the Krieg, it seemed like the commissars. It was more along the lines of keeping them from charging more often than not, and keeping them and following orders not to just massacre themselves and for the good of the Imperium, than actually making sure that they do charge towards the enemy. That makes sense.
Okay, I don't remember saying anything to that extent.
The Krieg seem, to me anyways, from what you were talking about, they seem far more suicidal than your average Cadian or Austrian Militarum unit.
They treat their life less than other ones, I guess is the better way to put it. Suicidal, no. They just don't treat their life very high in value. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, fair enough. Well, tell us anyways about these weapons that the orcs are going to be carrying into battle.
Now, as I mentioned, and unsurprisingly, orcs are not really trained in martial skills. It's genetically ingrained, and then also through constant fighting amongst each other, that's where their skill comes from. But there's three main weapons that you see amongst the regular boys. One is the probably most famous, which is the choppa. It can be anything from just a sharp wedge on a stick to a chain weapon.
It's got to be made of metal, though, right? That's, I think, the only thing that consistently is the same with all choppas.
Yeah.
Like if you have a sharp stick, I don't think they call that a choppa.
Well, if there's a little bit of metal on it, they may.
On the front end of it, anyways, you attach like a pointy end, like a spear. Yeah, they may call that a choppa.
I'd probably call it a stabba.
Oh, there you go. But yeah, as far as I know, that's the only thing, anyways, that's the only cohesive thing, anyways, out of all choppas is that they all have to be made of some sort of metal.
Or have some sort of edge-like shape.
Right.
Or chain.
Right, yeah. Like a chain sword would be considered a choppa.
And then they also have the so-identified big choppa, which is just a two-handed choppa.
Those, from what I've seen of those, they're
much bigger.
And a little bit more sophisticated than just something sharp a lot of times. Like most of the time, it looks like they're like chain axes. But yes, normally it requires two hands to wield them.
Okay. But when it comes to the average boy's ranged weapons, you normally see either shootas, which are basically a facsimile between a stubber or a bolter. An orc's facsimile of it, so that doesn't say much. And
like
the other would be a slugga, which is basically the orc's facsimile of a bolt pistol.
Right. Do the rounds explode like they do in bolters?
I guess if the orcs thought of them doing it, yeah.
Or is it just like heavy lead being slung out across the battlefield?
Probably more like lead being.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a shooter is kind of like a 50 cal like machine gun or something, and then what's the pistol one again? A slug.
Well, that's more. The 50 cal would be more like the big shootas.
Okay. So what kind of size round are we looking at here?
Okay, so for shooter, it'd be something more akin to a like assault rifle. If you were to look at it that way. It'd be like, okay, you have pistol, you have assault rifle, then you have the fully automatic saw.
Anti-personnel weapon, and then you got tactical stuff. Yeah.
Would be the big shooter, and then you have,
Okay.
That's just a rough example because, as we know, nothing is necessarily standard when it comes to orcs.
Right.
And then on top of that, they have other weapons, like they have their burnas, which I think we mentioned in a prior Vox, but it's basically a flamethrower that can also be set up to be like a uh, welding torch, so they can just like cut through thick metal with it. And then you have, of course, their rocket launchers, sort of self-explanatory there too. Rocket launchers. They have their tank hammers, which is a rocket attached to the end of a stick. But of course, they have one of our personal favorites. I'm sure you agree, is the shock attack gun.
Yeah. The shock attack gun is pretty cool. And we did talk about it for when we talked about the orcs, but you mind give me a refresher on what it is? It's still one of my favorites.
So nobody knows exactly how it does it, but the shock attack gun projects a force field through the warp, beginning at the end of the barrel and ending roughly where the gun is aimed. The portals look like small spinning black holes. In this way, it is possible for living creatures to travel through the warp towards the exit point. Though the field maintains the integrity, an unprotected journey through the warp is a very horrifying experience, and no orc would agree to being fired. And the Gretchen have the brains enough to avoid it, so mech operators of the shock attack gun gather snotlings, who are brainless enough to serve as its ammo. They're fired out of the gun, driven out of their tiny minds in the process. This has the effect of terrifying the snotlings, making them exit the portal in a frenzy, ripping and tearing at anything they encounter as they leave the portal. This is effective because the mech often tries to aim the gun directly on top of enemy soldiery, and they emerge inside the living creatures or enemy tanks, ripping them apart from within, as well as landing nearby due to the very effective condensed exit point. Otherwise, they're seen dropping out of the sky onto unsuspecting enemy troops.
Okay. Real quick before we move on, I don't think I've ever asked this. What does happen to the snotling anyways after it's shot? Because it doesn't seem like it kills them, but they are quite mad afterwards. So, do they shoot him again? They round him up again and shoot him, or
I think they nearly die.
Why?
Because you have this little tiny creature. Let's say it ends up inside of a tank. It's not really going to be able to do anything inside of the tank except for wreak havoc.
Right.
And then it probably won't know how to get out.
I get most of them will die, but the process itself, anyways, of shooting them doesn't seem to kill them. So if they happen to survive the battle, what happens?
They're probably...
Is it just business as usual, or because they've gone through the warp, they get like warp sickness or something and they die anyways? Do they explode?
My guess is that since they're mad and they try to attack anything, they'd just be killed by an orc, probably.
So it's just kind of business as usual.
Yeah.
Done. Okay. All right. It's a little different. Yeah, I was just kind of wondering that. I was like, well, what happens when they're done?
Mind you, there was a case where a orc was shot out of a shock attack gun.
You know what happened to it?
Well, we don't know how he got crunched into the shock attack gun to begin with. So apparently it did not turn out well on the other end.
So it came out in pieces. Well, fair enough.
Probably. And for people that want to know more about that, we talk about that when we talk about notable orcs.
Mm-hmm.
But before we move on to whatever else you're going to talk about, we missed last time when we talked about orcs two kind of important weapons of war, which I would like to correct today.
Oh, and what would that be?
Well, actually, technically, it's 3 or 4.
Oh.
It's the walkers.
Oh, you mean like the killer cans and the
The
death dreads?
sorry, I should say the regular type of walkers. Not we
Right.
aren't talking about the super heavies this time
Oh,
around, like
so
the
no
Stompas and the
stompas. Yeah.
Gargants and the
So you
Morkanauts and Gorkanauts.
so you talk about like the killer cans, the death dreads, and the mechas.
And the Mega Dreads, which sometimes are referred to as Mecha Dreads because those ones are done by Mech Boys, and so they have all this. Anyways, we'll get to that.
Okay, go for it.
You see, the Killer Can and the Death Dread are very similar design, yet the biggest difference is size and pilots. The Killer Can, being smaller of the two, is run by Gretchen after Mech Boy hardwires the little fella into the machine.
Kind of like a dreadnought. Oh, kind of.
Exactly. The only difference is, as opposed to the Space Marine that is on death's door and would die otherwise, the grot that is put into Killacan is quite healthy.
That's pretty terrible. Jeez.
Well, they don't think so.
Like they don't think so? Really?
Really. In fact, dreams of luring over their larger masters and handing out some damage for a change fill their little brains with delight. Indeed, such can be the competition among them that many mech workshops and grot mobs hold impromptu lotteries to decide who is picked to pilot the new cans. This is a cut down on the murder and backstabbing between the hopeful candidates. Once ensconced in their new metal bodies, it is not unknown for the grot inside to seek out and wreak some well-earned revenge on their former oppressors. While this is looked on as normal and indeed funny by the orcs, most mechs soon learn the wisdom of fitting their killer cans with a handy off switch in order to keep them dormant between battles. Killer cans and death dreads are both combat walkers, the cans faster than their larger counterparts, but with less deca. Killer cans, much like death dreads, have snipping claws, chugging heavy weapons, and lumpy metal holes. Though individually smaller than a death dread, killer cans charge towards the enemy lines and jostling mobs of riveted iron and roaring saw blades. The killer cans grot pilots put their relative skills with firearms to good use, blowing the zog out of anything unlucky enough to cross their path. Despite being hardwired into a 10-foot tall killing machine, Killacan pilots still retain a good degree of Gretchen cowardice. As a result, they still believe in safety in numbers and have a bad habit of losing their nerve under fire. It's not unheard of for Killacans to waddle about in circles or freeze up entirely at the first sign of danger. Now, on the other hand, Death Dreads are run by proper Ork Boyz, who also clamor at the chance to be welded into one of these hulking monstrosities. However, the process of creating a Death Dread is the opposite of what these orcs usually want, as their dreams of power are hampered by the fact that they are permanently wired into a metal can. This causes orcs inside to turn a bit mad, and hence new Death Dreads often need running in, often at the expense of any nearby buildings. Death Dreads are rare greenskin war engines and will cost an orc war boss or warlord around 100 greenskin teeth to build and or purchase from another clan. Because of this, unlike Killacans, who are used as shock troops, Death Dreads are used sparingly and mainly as support warriors. This irritates none more than the pilots locked within, whose only release from the tedium of being welded inside these machines comes in slaughtering their foes on the battlefield. When they are deployed in support of an orc mob, however, the destruction they inflict on their enemies is truly shocking to behold. Only the most stalwart or foolish of Imperial Guard troopers can stand against these metal monsters, whose crushing feet, tearing claws, and rattling guns shatter anything that falls within range. Now, Mega Dreads, on the other hand, are a different animal altogether. The Mega Dread is a hulking armor-plated monster much larger and considerably more powerful than the more commonly encountered Death Dreads and Killicans. They fit enormous hydraulic power into a relatively compact frame, which makes them far more maneuverable on the battlefield than the larger Stompa. Megadreads are usually armed with a combination of kill cannons, claws, and other high-caliber weapons. Okay, so the Megadreads, there is a variant. They're called Mecha Dreads, and the only real difference is that since mech generally is the person using it, they have it upgraded with like mech tech and weaponry. So they'll actually have like a custom force field attached on there, and rocket racks and atom smashers and mech weapons, in other words, instead of just a big cannon. But I digress. Being larger and more sophisticated than standard orc walkers, most mega dreads are controlled by a hybrid system of detachable surgical implants, which are often hammered in and then pried out of the pilot's head during and after battle.
Oh, so these guys can get out of the walker as opposed to the Death Dreads and the Killicans?
Yes.
Ah.
To the mech boys, they're able to build these monstrosities. They are the ultimate killing machines, and a war boss can expect to pay a hefty amount of teeth to acquire them. Now that I've discussed that, how about you talk about notable leaders of the Steel Legion?
Sure. Probably the most famous Steel Legion leader is Commissar Yark. But we're not going to talk about him because he's going to get a box of his own. I would like to talk, though, about a tank commander.
Hey, I thought that was my job.
Normally it is, but this time you've been talking so much about the orcs, I figured I'd throw in a tank commander.
Fair enough, but tell me, who is this fancy tank commander of yours?
He goes by the name of Pious Corin.
Ha! Even sounds pretty. Very well. Let's hear about this Pious Corin.
Well, Pious Corin was born into a family which traditionally served in the Imperial Navy. His father was an executive officer of the battleship Sea of Glass, and his grandfather was the Rear Admiral of the battle fleet Justikov. It was a great disappointment to his family that the young Pious showed no aptitude or interest whatsoever in void combat. Still, his family members used all the influence they could to bring to bear to ensure that the young man received a commission and a prestigious post aboard a frigate operating out of St. John's Dock in the Armageddon system. Alas, it was to no avail, and in very little time the young officer was finding himself before disciplinary hearings following a number of incidents in the officers' mess. The matter came to a head during an interfleet officers' soiree, when Pious struck a visiting Commodore in retaliation for a particularly cutting insult. Pious was immediately ejected from the party, and the very next morning was given the choice of summary dismissal or court-martial before the fleet commissariat. To make matters worse, the infamous Ork warlord Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka launched his second invasion of the Armageddon system, thus beginning the Third War for Armageddon in 998.M41. The young Pious petitioned his officers to allow him back aboard his vessel, but they dared not risk the wrath of the commissariat. Pious had no alternative but to evacuate St. John's Dock alongside other non-essential personnel, and within a solar week found himself at the besieged hive Vulcanus on the subcontinent of Armageddon Prime. Raging against fate and ashamed of his actions, Pious made straight for the nearest Armageddon Ash Waste militia depot and signed up, eventually becoming an officer in the Armageddon Steel Legion of the Imperial Guard. Despite his failure as an Imperial naval officer, Pious proved an exemplary officer cadet of the ground forces and was soon commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned command of a Lehman Russ tank squadron. Towards the latter stages of the war, Pious is one of the highest rated tank aces of the entire Armageddon Steel Legion, having scored hundreds of orc vehicle kills, including 3 Stompas. Now, as the war ground on, Pious quickly rose through the ranks of the Steel Legion and soon bore the rank of Major. He now commanded a mighty Shadow Sword super heavy tank known as the Iron Saint. He's extremely proud of the fact that the vehicle has never been shot out from under him, and regards with disdain those tank aces who take pride in the number of tanks they have lost in action. The Iron Saint bears the gray and green ash waste camouflage of the Armageddon Steel Legion, augmented by his personal heraldry, and dozens of distinct kill markings earned over a long, distinguished career during multiple bloody campaigns. Over the course of the war, the crew of the Iron Saint was transformed from a band of inexperienced rabble to a highly skilled group of veterans at armored warfare. Every member of the crew made himself indispensable, and Corrin stated on many occasions that none of the numerous medals awarded to him could have ever been earned without the efforts of every single member of his crew. For example, take the ex-convict Tricky Santuk, whose skills as a chief driver allowed the Iron Saint to advance in amongst the Stompa mob and disable all 3 enemy walkers with rear shots. Or the chief gunner Grok's Eye McConey, who once put a Vulcan cannon shot into a blazing red left eye of a Goggin from a range of 4.5 miles away. Other crew members include Crew Chief Gruff McGruff, whose strict regime has kept discipline in the face of overwhelming odds, and the cook Private Grot Olkin, who once took over the main gun when Grok's Eye was wounded in action, and with it destroyed 5 tanks, 3 of which even belonged to the enemy.
Huh?
But it was on the featureless wastes of the Anthrad that Major Pius Corrin and his crew truly earned their place in the annals of Armageddon's official histories. The Iron Saint was refueling and reprovisioning at a logistic base south of the Deathmire defense line, when the Orks unleashed an armored thrust from an entirely unanticipated quarter. As an entire mob of stompers and dozens of battle wagons struck north towards the Imperium's exposed flank, Corrin found himself as the only man who could prevent an unprecedented disaster. Knowing he had no time to await reinforcements, Corrin set out on a direct course for the Ork armored column, spotting the lead battle wagon as the sun set. Over the next 8 solar hours, the lone Shadow Sword engaged the Ork force, 1 vehicle at a time, firing over infrared sights before moving, locating another target, and firing again. Shot after incandescent shot lanced out of the darkness to destroy enemy after enemy. Soon the gunner had no need for his infrared sights, the glow of burning vehicles illuminating the battlefield to such an extent that he could fire over open sights. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the Anthrad plain was scattered with the blackened wrecks of Ork stompers and battle wagons, littering an area several hundred square miles. Corrin was awarded a chest full of medals and declared the greatest take ace the Armageddon Steel Legion had ever produced. Well, Yuksen, was this tank commander pretty enough for you?
Well, I'm surprised that the tank that they're in hasn't been demolished.
The Shadow Sword?
Yeah.
We briefly went over those. Aren't those the ones that they're designed as tank killers, right?
You mean Titan killers?
Well, Titans and big tanks. So like killing Stompas and Gargants, that's kind of what they're designed for, right?
Yes. It's equipped to hunt and destroy enemy Titans.
Right. So Gargants, Stompas, both of those would be kind of acceptable sizes. Battle wagons, though, would be kind of small game for it, right?
Yes.
I mean, obviously, it could destroy a battle wagon. It's just that's not really what they're designed for.
Well, I am surprised that it's in one piece.
Right.
It is pretty impressive that he's actually able to kill that many things as quickly, apparently, as he did, judging by how the tank also operates. But
well, it's got a volcano cannon on it, right? So that thing, if I recall right, it's actually kind of an obtuse tank, if I recall right, because it has to stop to charge and charge the volcano cannon. Then it fires it, and then it can move. And then it has to wait for the cannon to recharge, and then when it goes to fire it again, it has to stop again, correct?
Yeah.
So, quite frankly, anyways, I'm more shocked, like you said, anyways, that it survived, because every time it would blast, it would have to, evacuate the area before it gets swarmed. So, fairly interesting. Not only that, but, I mean, these are, okay, it's built on the chassis of their super tank, which I can't remember the name of it.
Pain Blade.
Yeah. And how many people normally actually run that thing?
Uh,
Say
let's see.
10 or 12, right? They're pretty big.
Technically, you only need 6 people to operate a shadow sword. Technically. I'm guessing you're going to have more than that.
Probably a few more. Yeah. So it's like if you're running a skeleton crew, you've got 6 guys.
Yeah.
All right. I quite frankly, after I read about this guy, I actually tried to see if some scribe had written a book about him, and I can't seem to find it. So it just seems like it's I haven't been able to find something.
How much of it do you think is propaganda?
Quite frankly, not a lot. I mean, it is possible. It's just, I don't know. It's one of those possible but improbable. Kind of like when you read about Cyphus Cain. It's possible that happened. It's also pretty improbable that he survived a lot of his stuff. So, I mean, I could see it happening the way that it did, but it could also very well be anyways that like you said, it could also very well be propaganda, but I don't think so.
Well, when I think of propaganda is like how many he killed and stuff like that. That's what I mean about propaganda.
Well, okay. Let me put it this way. Not once does it actually mention in here anyways during that night how many he actually destroyed.
Okay.
It just says that he literally fended them off. And he killed enough of them anyways that the guy that's firing his main battle tank or his main gun didn't need to use infrared because of the darkness. He could see because of all the fires, the tanks that had blown up.
Right.
So, yeah, to me anyways, I mean, it could be very much, I bet anyways, there's a lot of hyperbole in this.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's propaganda, let's put it that way. That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Is Pius his actual first name, or is it just...
From what I gather, that is actually his first name. It's Pius Corin. That's his name.
Kind of makes sense, judging by his upbringing.
Well, on that note, we're out of time for today. Join us next week as we discuss the big one himself, Morkenquirk's Great Green Prophet, Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka.
Fantastic! But if you enjoyed our little show, could you please be so kind as to push that subscribe, like, or follow button? And if you wish to help us expand our work on 40k lore, by all means, support us by joining our membership program on our YouTube channel, Tales of Asharaka.
Yes, and most importantly, have a great day. And until next time, this is Zeckthar
And Yuksen.
signing off.